What was the scariest "we need to leave now" moment that you've ever had? I was at the fair with my wife and our 6-year-old daughter. From the moment we arrived, I had a feeling we shouldn't be there, a pit of the stomach sense that this wasn't the place for us. I told my wife, but she brushed it off. She loves the fair. The girls were having fun, and we had tickets for the monster truck show. Halfway through the show, during an intermission, I said, "Nope, we are leaving now. Not going to argue. It's time to go." It was a 25-minute drive home, and by the time we arrived, the news, the local paper's website, and Facebook were all reporting a gang-related shooting at the fairgrounds and the concessions area we had just walked through. There was a huge police and EMS response. It had happened probably less than a minute after we got to the car. We didn't hear the shots and never told our daughter, but needless to say, my wife now trusts my gut instincts. Edit. For those asking, the feeling started in the car and grew stronger as we approached the fair. To the best of my memory, I spoke up before we even entered the gates, and the feeling intensified over the next 4 or so hours we were there. We went on rides, saw animals, ate the food, and so on. But during the monster truck show, it reached the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. One of you is correct in guessing where and when this took place. The USA clearly needs more sensible gun laws. Seeing how many other places people have said similar incidents have happened makes me sad. Story 2. I had been staying at my boyfriend's, at the time, place, and needed to pop home to grab more clothes. The moment I walked inside, I got this overwhelming feeling that the house didn't want me there. No one was home. It was dark and silent, and the atmosphere felt wrong. I ran upstairs, grabbed whatever was closest, and got the hell out. I remember standing in the driveway afterward, looking back at the house with the most intense sense of dread I've ever felt. A week later, we hosted my 21st at home. A few strange things happened. While my sister, cousin, and I were doing our hair, I smelled something that reminded me of smoke. My cousin insisted it was just the straightener, so I brushed it off. Then my grandmother asked if I was cold, because it was winter and I was wearing a sleeveless dress, and suggested turning on the heater. For some reason, I decided not to, which was unusual for me because I always use it in winter. Meanwhile, one of the downlights in the main room started flickering again. It had been doing that randomly for weeks, but we never thought much of it. Later that night, after all the guests had left and we were in bed, I woke up to the smoke alarms absolutely blaring. At first, I was in denial, telling myself it was just the house alarm. It sometimes went off by itself, so I tried to key in the code, but nothing worked. Accepting that it really was the smoke alarm, I went downstairs thinking, where is this fire? There's no fire here. Sure enough, when I reached the main room where we had just been, I looked up at the ducted heating vent and saw bright orange flames flickering inside. It was unreachable. The fire spread between the 2 floors and melted a water pipe, causing water to pour from the ceiling. At the time, I couldn't process the danger I was in. It all made no sense to me. We all got outside, including our 2 dogs and some guests who had stayed over, and watched the whole house burn down. There was an explosion when the fire reached the gas. I have never felt such intense, acute terror in my life. Later, when the engineer inspected the house, he said the fire started from a faulty downlight and had been smoldering for at least a few days. That explained the smell when we were doing our hair, and the flickering light. If I had turned the heater on that night, it could have ignited with all our guests inside. Who knows what would have happened? So, my house burned down on my 21st birthday. We lost everything. Story 3. I was hiking with some friends in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. We'd gotten pretty far down the trail, and it was getting close to evening when, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream came from the underbrush. It was distinctly a mountain lion. We immediately turned back and started walking calmly in the opposite direction. For the entire hour hike back, the feeling of being watched never left us. Every so often, we'd hear another noise from the mountain lion, just enough to know it was still there, quietly stalking us the whole way out. Story 4. I went to a music festival alone. After it ended, I was waiting for an Uber to take me back to where my car was parked. While I was waiting, a random guy pulled up and asked, "Do you need a ride?" I wasn't thinking clearly. I was extremely drunk and assumed he was my Uber, so I got into his SUV. While he was driving, he kept making inappropriate innuendos, telling me how attractive I was, and asking how I was going to pay him for the favor he was doing. My spidey senses went off like an alarm. Luckily, he had to stop for gas. Once he went inside to pay, I quietly and slowly opened the passenger door, rolled out, and ran to a dark corner. When he came back, he was extremely angry and looked for me. He eventually gave up, which felt like forever while I hid. After waiting 10 minutes for my heart to calm down, I called an actual Uber and made sure to check the license plate first. Story 5. In Bangalore, India, I was there on a study abroad program, having already spent 3 months in India a few years earlier. It was the first night, and all the students were meeting for dinner at a designated spot. We hopped into Ubers and tuk-tuks from where we were staying to make the trip. I got into a tuk-tuk with 2 other girls and kept an eye on the route since it was a new city while they chatted. At first, everything was fine, but then we took a wrong turn. The map indicated when the driver should make a U-turn, but he didn't. It gave another chance, and still he made no move. I started feeling that sense of dread and told the girls we were heading the exact wrong way, but they insisted it was fine and that he'd turn around when he could. Traffic was crazy, and I could only hope we'd get back on track. I started gesturing to the driver that we needed to turn back, but he just waved me off. We were on a highway-like road. I remember a big bridge, though I'm not sure if it was a full highway, heading in the exact opposite direction, toward an area of the city where tourists definitely shouldn't go. Businesses were already closed, or closing for the night. The lights were fewer, and everything looked increasingly run down. I finally started shouting that I was going to jump out, because I would rather get hit by another car than be taken to a second location. By then, it was painfully obvious he was taking us somewhere else. I began to make a move to jump, and the other 2 girls started screaming. Surprisingly, the driver slowed down and let us off in the middle of the road before speeding off. I assume the thought of getting hit by another car with witnesses nearby was worse for him, but I'm not sure. Thankfully, there was a candy shop just closing, and the woman inside let us wait there until another Uber could take us back to the restaurant. I don't think the other 2 girls ever truly believed me that something dangerous was happening, but we had already gone about 20 minutes in the wrong direction, with plenty of time and opportunity to turn back, while the driver completely ignored my protests and headed into a known sketchy area. Personally, I've really enjoyed the 6 months I've spent in India, and I've been fortunate that the scary or uncomfortable situations tourists often describe never happened to me. But that moment is definitely in my top 3 scariest experiences. Story 6. My wife was about 1 month away from the due date for our first child. Something didn't feel right to her, so she wanted to get checked. I immediately drove her to the hospital. The baby's heart rate suddenly dropped very low, and they performed an emergency C-section. He was born with an APGAR score of 1, 0 being death, looked exhausted, wouldn't raise his arms, and spent 8 days in the NICU, many of them under an oxygen hood. Right after he was born, the anesthesiologist told us he might be disabled. I have never been so scared in my life, worried we might lose him. Many years later, he is now in college and perfectly healthy, thankfully. Edit. My wife was in a room recovering for several days and couldn't see my son in the NICU. Every day, I would visit him there and then go check on her. On the 3rd day, I brought her a framed photo of him from his first hour in the askreddit world so she could see him from her hospital bed. She broke down in tears. On the 4th day, he was out of the oxygen hood, and I got to hold him for the first time. Later that day, I brought my wife down to the NICU in a wheelchair, and she saw him in person for the first time since his birth. When the nurse asked, "Would you like to hold him?" she burst into tears again, sobbing tears of joy. It was an incredibly emotional time. Story 7. I was in Barcelona with some friends and ended up in a pretty local bar, having a few drinks with the barman. He mentioned another bar and said he'd take us there in a taxi as he was finishing up. We got in a taxi with him and started driving a long way, eventually getting into rural areas. I asked him how far we were going, and he just laughed and said something in Spanish to the driver, who laughed as well. At some traffic lights, I pushed my 2 friends, who were much drunker than me, out of the car and told them to run. Luckily, we found another taxi and jumped in. The driver was surprised, as were we, since we were miles from anywhere a tourist should be. He was on his way home, but still took us back to the city. Story 8. Not quite a leaf, but I was living in Kansas. My boyfriend and I were sitting on a friend's front porch when cops came flying up the street, slammed on the brakes, and yelled, "Get the F in the house." We did. Our friend wasn't home, but thankfully the door was unlocked. It turned out there was a man walking around, shooting at anything that moved. We didn't know this at first. This was around 2002, so we didn't have the internet in our pockets. Our friend came home about an hour later and explained what was happening. Not long after, there was commotion in the backyard. It was the man being chased by police. They arrested him just a few feet from the back door. Story 9. I've posted this a couple of times. My family was crossing the English Channel on a ferry in 1979. My brother, then 11, and I, then 13, got bored sitting in a large lounge with our parents. So we wandered around, looking at things. A man approached us and asked if we were Canadian. I was wearing a t-shirt from the Canadian Embassy Club in Moscow. We said we were, and he said he was too. We chatted a bit about where we were from. He looked to be in his 20s. I still remember his shoulder-length hair and 70s-style mustache. He told us he had bumper stickers on his car, parked several levels below, and invited us to go see them. We both said no. We kept chatting, and he kept trying to get us to go down and see his car. It was getting really creepy, so I grabbed my brother and said we were going to have dessert with our parents, or some other excuse. We told them what had happened and stayed close to them for the rest of the evening. I couldn't figure out why he was trying to lure us to his car. If he wanted to essay me, why involve my brother? And we were a little too young to be selling drugs, so that didn't make sense either. Story 10. We were camping in the dead of night, and I was sleeping. I was around 12 or 13. My brother came into my tent, whispered that we had to leave, and picked me up. I didn't question it, and just went with him. We drove for a while until he pulled over and made a call. He told the police that a man was walking around our campsite with a gun, threatening to kill us. We later found out it was his girlfriend's dad. Fun times. Story 11. I was camping at a national park with 2 friends, 3 of us sharing a tent. It was one of those drive-up spots with a picnic table and a fire pit, so it wasn't deep woods camping. In the middle of the night, I had to pee. I went out to a nearby spot and did my business without any issue. Walking back, I stopped to look at the stars and light a cigarette. I was there maybe a minute or two when I suddenly felt a wave of what I can only describe as primal instinct. My adrenaline sharpened everything as I listened. Nothing had changed, no new sounds, no movement, but I just knew something was there, watching me. I calmly put my cigarette out and walked back to the tent without any sudden movements. I got inside and waited, listening. There was nothing, so I figured I had just spooked myself and went back to sleep without any issue. In the morning, we found our campsite absolutely destroyed. Some animal had come through looking for food, I guess, but it hadn't touched the tent. Even my friend's old baseball hat, the one he had been sweating in all summer, was ripped to shreds. We found pieces of it scattered everywhere. It had been sitting on the picnic table. I learned to listen to my gut after that. Story 12. When my husband and I were teenagers and had just started dating, we parked in an empty golf course for some privacy. We had been to this spot before. It was a great place to walk around at night and then make out in the car. But that night felt different. As soon as we pulled in, something felt wrong. I reclined my seat to hide myself, suddenly paranoid that someone was watching us. We sat there for a few moments, making awkward small talk. Then I felt a wave of overwhelming dread and quietly asked if we could leave. My then boyfriend agreed immediately, almost too quickly, considering the hormones of teenage boys and the plans we had to fool around. He peeled out of the parking lot, my seat still fully reclined, because at that point, I was convinced we were not alone. The bottom of the Honda scraped the edge of the driveway as we pulled out in a panic. We still had not said anything to each other about what we were feeling, but his reaction told me we were on the same page. We were in danger. We drove a few miles away before either of us spoke, and I finally put my seat back upright. I tried to laugh it off and admitted I was not sure why I was scared. He felt the same. Neither of us had any explanation for the sudden fear we both experienced, but we decided not to question it too much. We found out after the fact that there had been a brutal attack on a couple of teens walking home from the burger place by the golf course, carried out by a schizophrenic homeless man. I am convinced we both felt like someone was watching us because he was, and I know that if we had gone on our usual late night walk, something terrible would have happened. This happened almost 16 years ago, but I can still remember that fear vividly. Story 13. I was sitting in a pub in London with my friend, debating whether to get one more beer before heading back to my place. He really wanted to get a half, but I suddenly had this unbelievably strong feeling that we needed to leave right then. It hit me like a wave of pure anxiety, tangible and overwhelming, and I remember thinking, this is really frigging weird. I told my friend, no, I'm good, let's go. We caught the bus just outside the pub and went home without any issues. 2 days later, he messaged me, holy crap, look at this article. That same bus stop, about 30 minutes after we left, a homeless man randomly attacked a woman waiting for the bus and stabbed her repeatedly, killing her. If we had stayed for that half, it's almost certain we would have been standing exactly where she was at that time. Could we have stopped it? Would one of us have died instead? Was that why I had that horrible feeling? I cannot explain it, but it chills me to this day. Story 14. This is my father's story, not mine, but it's still remarkable. He was working in construction as a contractor, leading a team on an old estate on a hillside. It was a clear day, the weather was fine, and they were up on scaffolding, working on the chimney. Suddenly, my father felt an urgent pressure to go down immediately. It was inconvenient. They hadn't been up there long, and climbing down the scaffolding was a hassle, so he resisted for a bit. But the feeling was overwhelming, a tremendous urging to descend right away. He finally told his team to go down. They asked why, confused because they were in the middle of work, but he insisted. They went down, and a few minutes later, all stood on the lawn, looking at one another sheepishly. Moments later, a lightning strike hit the chimney they had just been working on. When he told me the story, hours later, he was still visibly shaken. Story 15. It was just before Christmas, and my then boyfriend, now husband, and I had gone back to my hometown to visit my family. We went out for some drinks with my mom and my sister, and we bumped into a woman who lived on my mom's street. She insisted on inviting us to the after party once the pub closed. Mom was excited and wanted to go. My sister said no and went to bed, but we were guilt-tripped into going because Mom didn't want to go alone. We got there and walked in through the front door. I immediately headed to the kitchen with a sinking feeling, already trying to figure out how I could get outside again. There was a set of keys next to the fruit bowl, and one of them fit the back door. I kept saying I didn't want to be there and wanted to go home. Mom told me to mingle, relax, and not ruin it for her, and my husband was starting to sense what I was feeling and wanted to leave too. Mom had just made us drinks and was heading back toward the living room when we heard the front door slam open, a man shouting and demanding payment for drugs. Everyone else started yelling, swearing, and screaming. Needless to say, I went straight out the back door, followed by my husband and Mom. We were there for about 30 minutes in total, and it wasn't until we got back somewhere safe that I felt like I could breathe again. Story 16. In 2018, my mom was supposed to be in Paradise for a sleep study and a doctor's appointment, the same day as the campfire. Luckily, the fire started in the morning, so she hadn't arrived at the hospital yet, which ended up burning down. She lived in a potential evacuation zone and hesitated to leave. Meanwhile, I was in Jaipur, boarding a transpolar flight to Vancouver, Canada, which would take 14 hours. The fire was moving through Paradise just as my flight was taking off. It really unsettled me to think I would be in an information void for 14 hours, not knowing what was happening. I shared my concerns with a flight attendant who spoke with the captain after we took off. She returned and asked me to write a message, which the captain would relay to the ground before we reached the North Pole, where communications would become more difficult. A few hours later, the flight attendant came back with a strip of paper containing a message. My mom had evacuated, and my sister had driven down to pick her up along with her belongings. I probably still have that paper strip somewhere. Story 17. On a trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, somewhere like Indian Grave, we suddenly heard a noise that sounded like it could only come from a large, severely injured cow. All three of our faces drained of color, and we booked it out of there. Later, sitting in a restaurant in Dollywood, we found the source of the noise on YouTube, a baby bear. I've never heard that sound before or since, but my heart skipped a beat that day, and something deep in my animal instincts knew we needed to leave immediately. Story 18. This was about 4 years ago, right after COVID. I was at a well-known all-inclusive resort in Cancun for vacation. It was very early in the morning, just past dawn. I had the infinity pool to myself and decided to enjoy it. I wandered to the infinity edge, which overlooked the beach and ocean. I was standing there taking in the view when motion below caught my eye. 2 men were down on the sand behind the hotel sign, digging. They pulled up a box a little bigger than a shoebox. Something told me not to move and not to stare. I shifted my gaze to the horizon, acting as if I hadn't noticed anything at all. In my peripheral vision, I could see that they had stopped digging and were looking up at me. None of us moved for a few minutes. Then they went back to what they were doing. I slowly drifted backward from the edge, got out of the pool, and went straight back to our room. Later that morning, once the drinks and loud music were in full swing, 3 police officers showed up and began investigating the spot where the men had been digging. I am certain that acting like a clueless tourist enjoying the view kept me from becoming a concern to them. Story 19. When I was a kid, my mom ended up in a marriage with an abusive man. He never laid a finger on her while they were dating, but on their wedding night, he got physically aggressive with her. We'll call him George. We had moved halfway across the country with him, and he made a lot of money, so my mom didn't need to work, which meant we were completely trapped. She had no access to his money. All we had was her car. I was about 8 years old at the time. One day, while he was at work, we packed up the car and left, driving back across the country to the city we had lived in before. When we got there, we checked into a hotel and went to sleep. The next day, we went to my mom's favorite restaurant and bar. My brother, who was 17 at the time, we'll call him Matthew, was a bit psychic. Believe it or not, I really don't care. We were just sitting there having a good time when he suddenly knew George was close. He grabbed my mom's arm and said, "We have to go now." My mom didn't want to leave. She thought Matthew was scared or overreacting. He practically had to drag her out. We got in the car, and as we sat at the exit of the parking lot, waiting for traffic to clear so we could pull out, George drove in. Terrifying. Story 20. About 13 years ago, I was at the beach parking lot where everyone would hang out as young adults on summer evenings. Something came over me. Not dread or fear, but just a strong sense that something was off. It was a bad feeling, unlike anything I had experienced before, and my gut kept telling me it was time to go home. Honestly, the feeling wasn't strong enough that I couldn't have ignored it, since I've never been an especially fearful person. I told my friend at the time, "I'm leaving. Something feels off here." I got home, and less than 2 hours later, a gang shooting occurred at the beach. Unfortunately, a few friends from my old high school were shot. Fortunately, they survived. They weren't the target, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was about 6 months pregnant at the time, so leaving probably saved me from being caught up in it. Who knows what could have happened if I had stayed. Story 21. I lived in Philadelphia for a while, around the time of COVID, and my job had me traveling all over the city as a job coach. I worked with people with physical or developmental disabilities, visiting their job sites to make sure they were getting accommodations, being treated fairly, and helping them build skills to work independently. Sometimes my routes took me through parts of town that weren't the safest to walk alone, especially since I was short but had a fairly sizable chest and hips. I was leaving a site somewhere in Kensington in the late afternoon. I was checking my phone for transit when I suddenly started to feel antsy. I'd been anxious before and knew how to be cautious, but this feeling was on a whole different level. I started shaking from the dread, even though the street looked pretty empty. After a few seconds, it was like my body made the decision for me. I just started moving, walking fast, and putting distance between me and that spot. Turns out, a man came out of the overgrown lot next to me and started following me, shouting at me to come to him, calling me a bish, and threatening me for being there. Luckily, I happened to pass a halal food truck, and the chef jumped out with a huge knife and started yelling at the man. The man had a knife too, but he must have decided it wasn't worth it because he backed off. I was too shaken to ask the chef his name, but he stayed with me outside the truck until an Uber arrived. I wasn't going anywhere alone again. He didn't speak English, and I don't speak Arabic, but his kind tone made it clear he was trying to comfort me. He even gave me a lamb gyro for the road. He saved my life, and I wish I knew his name. It wasn't the only time I was saved by strangers in Philadelphia. I have to thank the POC community specifically for looking out for my white ass, because I never got help from the white folks when it came down to it. Here's to the halal chefs, street corner guys, subway attendants, shopping cart retrievers, and the one man who grabbed my backpack to stop me from falling down a flight of concrete stairs when my knee gave out. They kept me safe. Story 22. My family was living in South Sudan during the Civil War some years back. I was 11 at the time and remember waking up to gunfire all around our house and throughout the village. Once it died down, the entire village left for the refugee camps in Uganda. We followed them and moved to Uganda as well. It was a very frightening and traumatizing experience. Story 23. I've told this story to friends many times, but I've never posted it online. I am a female mountain guide. About 10 years ago, as a recently graduated guide, I decided to make a solo approach to where I wanted to set a base camp for climbing a mountain in the Darwin Range, South America. I'll be purposefully vague about the exact location. The first part of my hike followed a known multi-day trail that sees some traffic in the summer, though it is a very remote area. At some point, I planned to cut north and make my own route to the spot I wanted. I intended to stay 2 nights there to scout the area. It was winter, so I didn't expect to encounter anyone, even on the trail. It had snowed the day before, so I was breaking trail in mid-calf snow, which wasn't a problem. About an hour in, I was joined by 4 stray dogs, and after 3 hours, 2 of them were still with me, Goldie and Blackie, because my naming skills are basic. Around 5 hours in, I was sitting and having a snack when a group of 13 men, aged roughly 25 to 55, caught up to me. We made small talk. They were doing the multi-day route. I didn't specify where I was headed. I was only about an hour and a half from where I planned to cut north and was making good time, so I decided to slow my pace a bit after that. About an hour later, I stopped in a large opening for lunch. The group caught up and decided to stop there too. I had been eating bread and cheese, which I had finished, and 1 mandarin. The group had leftovers from a barbecue. Goldie and Blackie stayed with me the whole time and didn't beg for any food from them. In fact, when one of the men tossed a bone, Blackie growled and the hair on his back stood up. I got this immediate feeling that I needed to leave right then. I mean, a stray dog choosing to beg for an orange instead of a bone. That was strange, but since the trail was fresh, I didn't want to go first and reveal where I planned to turn off with my footprints. So I let the group go ahead under the excuse that they would pack down the trail and make it easier for me. The whole time, the conversation was pleasant, and nothing seemed outwardly strange from the people I spoke with. But I couldn't shake the feeling. When I knew I was close to the point where I wanted to cut off the trail, I fell back from the group and, without saying goodbye, just left the trail. I walked another 2 hours to the base of the mountain I was scouting and set up my camp in an opening, hidden behind some bushes. It was still quite early, so I had plenty of time to explore the next day. Honestly, I felt a bit silly for just disappearing like that. That night, Goldie and Blackie were still with me. The temperature was cold, about -14 Celsius, but next to the sea, that feels even colder and more humid. I felt bad for the dogs, so I let them into my tent, leaving the flap slightly open so they could do their business. 3 living things in the tent made it much warmer than just me alone, though I ended up smelling strongly of dog afterward. We shared some dinner and went to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, they started growling hard. I didn't know these dogs, and it honestly freaked me out a bit because I didn't want to get bitten. But they were growling at something outside the tent. There are no large mammals in that area, maybe a fox, but nothing I should have been worried about. I briefly considered turning on my flashlight to look, but that same gut feeling stopped me. I had a big hunting knife, but I'm aware that nobody wins in a knife fight, least of all, a small woman weighing 48 kilograms. The 2 dogs bolted out of the tent, growling and barking, then came back and lay next to me again. The same thing happened once more at about 20 minutes to 3, and then it stopped. It was not a restful night. I want to clarify that the whole time, there were no voices calling my name, nothing that would hint at a concerned search party, and there were no lights at all. I peeked outside without turning on my own light. If there had been any, I would have seen them. It was a clear night. In the end, I fell asleep, convinced it had probably been a fox, and that the dogs were just being territorial over their new pet, me. The next morning, though, I found 2 sets of snowshoe tracks that had followed my trail from the main path and circled all around the area where I'd camped. Whoever it was never came close to the tent, probably thanks to Blackie and Goldie. I replayed it in my head so many times, but if it had been someone with good intentions, they would have used a light, called out something. But there was nothing. Who retraces their steps to track a young woman alone in the woods in the middle of the night without announcing themselves, if they mean well? It definitely wasn't someone who'd simply seen me disappear into the woods and gotten worried. It's terrifying to think what could have happened if Goldie and Blackie hadn't decided to follow me that night. I went back home the next morning, and later that season I did climb that mountain again when a friend came to visit. P.S. I don't feel like rewriting the whole original post, but the dogs weren't actually strays, more like free-roaming farm dogs. Blackie and Goldie followed me all the way back to the house they'd come from the next day, and I like to think they're still there now, getting treats and chasing off bad guys. Story 24. I went to a house party in college with a group of 5 friends. It was hosted in a lofted apartment, and the whole drive there, I kept saying we shouldn't go. I just had this horrible gut feeling something bad was going to happen. About an hour after arriving, in the middle of a beer pong game, there was a loud cracking noise, and the floor gave out, similar to how the Titanic split in half. My friends and I fell 12 feet to the concrete floor below, along with a folding table and a bunch of glass bottles. The only people hurt were myself and 2 of my friends. I remember looking up once I hit the floor and seeing the refrigerator about 2 feet from falling on top of me. I think I said, "I told you so," for the rest of the year. Story 25. My wife and I did a road trip down south in New Zealand to a place called Aotearoa. It's a cute little French town on the east coast of the South Island. Since we're fans of hiking, we parked at a nearby forest trail and started our walk. It was around 3 in the afternoon on a beautiful sunny day, but we didn't see a single other person on the track. We're very used to bushwalking in remote places, but at some point during this walk, I suddenly felt goosebumps and a strong sense of dread. It was strange. I don't feel that way very often. I also noticed there were no birds chirping, which felt incredibly odd. It truly felt like someone was watching us. Eventually, I told my wife that I didn't like the feeling and thought we should cut the hike short and head back to the car. We both hurried back. I still don't have an explanation for that day, but I can clearly remember how I felt. Everything in my body was telling me to turn around and get back in the car. Story 26. Back in college, a group of friends and I were working at our spring carnival. The night before the first day, we had the job of setting up several spaces and worked until around 2 in the morning, putting together booths, tables, and whatnot. It was insanely cold that night for the area we were in. No snow on the ground, but icy and teeth-chattering cold. We were just about the only people left at the fairgrounds when one friend called through the flap of a mostly sealed food tent. "Come in here and warm up." I went in and found a group of us drinking beer, stretched out on the tops of tables, surrounded by gas grills that had all been turned on full blast to heat up the little tent. A couple of my friends were practically passed out. We'd been working hard. They had a few beers, and it was so warm in the tent. After only a few minutes, I too felt super tired and a little woozy, and I stretched out on a table. The tent grew very quiet, and I rolled over to tell a friend that we probably shouldn't fall asleep in there. Then I saw it. The air was wavy, like a mirage in the desert, and there were 6 or 7 of us, laid out straight on the tabletops, arms at our sides like bodies on morgue slabs. All I could say was, "The gas, get out," over and over, as I struggled to open the tent flaps. Once the cold outside air rushed into the tent, a couple of the others sat up, realizing what was happening. We all stumbled out, and the 2 who had been in there the longest ended up going to the hospital, while the rest of us had varying degrees of nausea, headaches, and vomiting. I don't think college me really understood in the moment that we had basically built ourselves a carbon monoxide gas chamber. But when I looked over and saw us all stretched out on the tables like that, there was this very calm voice in my head saying, "This is how they'll find our bodies." And it freaked me out. Story 27. Years ago, I flew home to Denver and took the shuttle to the parking lot. There weren't many people on the shuttle, but there was one guy who kept asking me questions, some semi-personal, and I couldn't wait to get off and get away from him. When the driver stopped at my area, I stood up, and the guy stood up and got off too. I had a really bad feeling in my gut, so I stayed on the shuttle and rode it all the way back to the terminal and then back to the parking lot. The driver asked me why I didn't get off, and I told him about the guy and the bad feeling I had. He said, "Always trust those gut feelings." When we finally returned to my area at the park and ride, the shuttle driver waited until I got into my car and backed out before he left. Story 28. My husband and I went on a road trip across the province last year, and on the last part of the trip, we booked a hotel for the night because we were too tired to drive. When we checked into our room, I immediately felt uncomfortable. Something just wasn't right. I went to use the washroom, and the toilet overflowed so badly that it spread past the bathroom and into the bedroom, so we switched to a different room. Outside, there were some drunk people, blood on the ground in front of our door, women screaming in the woods behind the hotel, and we saw some guys pull up in a van and unload hundreds of boxes into the room next to us. I started crying and said we needed to leave. I didn't care that the room was already paid for, or how tired I was. I was driving the rest of the way home, a 9-hour trip. A week later, there was a news report that the hotel had been used for trafficking women and drugs. I'm so glad we left that night. Story 29. Back in 2008, when I was in college, my friends and I broke into an old abandoned hotel from the 1930s in Mineral Wells, Texas. It felt like stepping into a time warp. Out of what I believe were 12 floors, we made it to 3. We went up past the pool. Apparently, the hotel had been famous for it because the mineral water was said to cure illnesses, through the kitchen and the massive ballroom, past the old elevator with the pull gate, where a kid had supposedly gotten his head severed and by a bunch of old creepy bedrooms with the furniture still inside. Then we heard a noise, a super loud screeching sound coming from a pitch black hallway. We all shined our lights toward it and saw nothing, but the sound kept getting louder and louder. We bolted as fast as we could. I still have no clue what it was, but I've never been more terrified in my life. Story 30. I've posted this before. I took a train and bus trip around Ireland in '78. As I was going into Sligo, I suddenly had an overwhelming feeling of dread, something I'd never experienced before or since. It was heavy and oppressive. I grabbed my things and ran across the platform to catch a train going right back out. I ended up in Mullingar, where I had a great stay and a wonderful dinner with people I met at the bed and breakfast. So maybe that was what was meant to happen, but I've never been able to figure it out. Story 31. Picture it, early 90s, hanging out with a girl I knew from middle school at her house. Her mom was at work, but her stepdad was home. He didn't say anything overtly strange, but his presence made me uneasy, the way he looked at us and just lingered. Later that evening, it was time for me to go home. It was the 90s, so it was my mom said I could go to her house if her parents would drive me home situation. Her mom had just gotten home from work and was tired, so the stepdad, overly eager, announced he would drive me. He told his wife not to worry and that he didn't mind at all. I had a huge knot in my stomach and immediately asked and basically begged the mom to take me instead. He drove an 80s style creeper van, and his excitement to drive me made my skin crawl. After some back and forth, her mom agreed to drive me, and I felt an immense sense of relief. Needless to say, I never went back to her house after that. Now, more than 20 years later, she talks about her abuse and advocates for mental health stemming from childhood trauma on her social media pages. I'm so glad I trusted my gut at such a young age. Story 32. 10 years ago, I was 20 and in Jamaica on vacation with a large group of multiple families celebrating a wedding. One evening, all the adults, 40 and up, were outside our hotel drinking, and I went for a walk on the beach with two other young girls, both a little younger than me. We were a few hotels down the beach when a Jamaican man approached us. He started off casually chatting and soon pointed down the coast toward the downtown scene. That is the real Jamaica. You have to check it out. I immediately realized he was trying to lure us somewhere else. I abruptly told the girls we should turn around and head back toward our hotel. He kept pace with us. I told him in a very stern tone that we didn't need a chaperone. He sort of laughed, said he didn't mind, and kept walking with us. I should point out that the other two girls, being younger than me, were both uncomfortable, but still stuck in that mindset that being polite was everything. They kept trying to chat with him and keep the peace. I, however, was completely over it. By the time we were nearly back at our hotel, he was still following us. I was firmly and loudly telling him that we had adults nearby who would be wondering where we were, that we were at our hotel, and that we were not going to a club with him. I was insistent and loud. Then a young guy approached, probably about my age, 20, white, looked like a tourist. For a moment, I felt relief. He saw what was happening and seemed to be stepping in. Then he shook hands and gave a quick bro hug to the Jamaican man. Oh crap. That was the moment I felt fight or flight kick in. It was time to go. He introduced himself, and before I had time to react or assert myself, the two of them had tied Rasta bracelets to our wrists and pulled out 3 red stripe bottles, uncapped them, and handed one to each of us. I vividly remember looking at my wrist and thinking, they've marked us. The white guy was chatting with the youngest of the 3 of us, a doe-eyed blonde who was only 17, nervously laughing and going along with what he was saying. I stepped back for a moment and said to the other girl, very firmly, "We need to get the hell away from here." The white guy paused in his friendly conversation for a split second, made eye contact with me, and his mask slipped for the tiniest moment. Pure hatred. At that point, I was done letting the other 2 girls play polite. I grabbed both of them, turned around, and yelled loudly behind us, "We aren't interested! Go away!" Our group wasn't far, drinking less than 50 yards away. I'm not sure how our story would have ended if I had been more naive, and honestly, I'm not interested in knowing. Story 33. Years ago, I was walking my dog at our usual spot and time in the neighborhood after work. We were on the sidewalk in front of the local school, and he was sniffing around when something in my gut screamed, "Cross the street right now." I've learned to listen to my gut in situations like that, so we immediately crossed the street. About 30 seconds later, a car came flying down the road, hopped the curb, took out a street sign, went down the sidewalk for a few feet, then got back on the road and drove off. Had we not crossed the street, they would have plowed right through us, probably killing us, given how fast they were going. Story 34. Two buddies and I had just graduated university and were out bar hopping one night. We were feeling no pain from a night of drinking, and as we walked back to my apartment at the end of the night, we spotted a pretty wild house party. Music was playing, people were hanging out in the front yard, and the front door was open. We walked over and started talking to a guy out front. He invited us in, and we found some beer in the kitchen and started drinking. One of my buddies started playing beer pong with a group of women who had never played before. We were having fun, but the conversations I was trying to have with people just seemed off. I finally asked the guy we had first met out front if he went to the same university we had just graduated from. He looked confused, then told me he was in high school. I laughed it off. No way. But as I looked around the house and at the people there, a panicked realization hit me. We were at a high school party. How did we not notice when we walked in? My heart sank, and I suddenly felt sick to my stomach. Here we were, in a stranger's house, surrounded by underage teens drinking. I felt like I was going to puke. I grabbed my buddies and yanked them out of there. Thankfully, nothing bad happened, and we got out safely. To this day, we still laugh about this drunken mix-up. Story 35. Not exactly scared, more of a nope moment. I drove for Lyft off and on for about a year, and this happened in Charlotte, North Carolina. I accepted a ride in an outlying neighborhood near the airport. I arrived at the address, which was on a road with a few houses, all dark. Streetlights were sparse. I couldn't find any house numbers, so I pulled into the driveway listed. I waited less than 30 seconds when a gut feeling screamed that something wasn't right. No lights came on, no message or call asking me to wait, and I didn't see anyone. I backed out and left. Right as I reached the end of the street, I got another ride request for the same location. I declined and got out of there fast. Walking home one night, I tried to take what I thought was a shortcut through an industrial park. I had lived in the area my whole life and knew there was a way through, but my phone battery was dead, so I couldn't check. I walked what I believed was the right path and reached the edge of the industrial park. The road continued, but there were no streetlights. It looked like a scene straight out of a fairy tale, dark, tree-lined, and eerie. The feeling that it was a bad idea to continue was so overwhelming that I turned back and took the long way home. Story 36. I was in Madrid at 16 with my strawberry blonde classmate who looked like a Bond girl, pixie cut, milky skin covered in strawberry blonde freckles, wearing short shorts and a tiny t-shirt that was basically a tank top. She ignored everyone's advice and concerns about standing out as an obvious tourist. We were in a very busy area and desperate for American food. We were looking for a fast food chain we'd heard about and turned down a side street to reach it. The side street turned out to be an alley, and suddenly we were surrounded by a group of young men talking really fast. The guys were flirty, giving compliments, and my friend seemed flattered, giggling and batting her lashes. But I immediately realized they were trying to move us away from the street and separate us. I went nuclear. I started waving my arms and yelling, grabbed her, and began dragging her back to the street. She was pissed. I was pissed. We were both hangry. She was a typical small town, spoiled, self-absorbed, naive girl. She believed she had found love in that alley and refused to acknowledge the danger she'd put us in. Her dumbass never forgave me for saving our lives. Story 37. 2017 or 2018, London. I was in a relationship of about 2 or 3 years. We had a little ritual. On our rare shared weekdays off, different stressful jobs, both of us self-employed. We'd sleep in, get lunch somewhere nice, then walk through a local park to burn a few calories before heading home for ice cream and Game of Thrones, or Narcos, if I remember correctly. On this day, everything was normal. We were almost at the gates of a central London park when, out of nowhere, I had this intense intuitive warning that we should not go any farther. I was so terrified, I didn't even explain. I just grabbed his hand and tried to yank someone who had about a 50-pound weight advantage and was 10 inches taller than me. He laughed and tugged me in the other direction, but I basically turned into a stubborn golden retriever and planted my feet. He stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. We wandered back, about a 20-minute walk, feeling a bit awkward. But once we were farther from the park, I finally explained that something had spooked me so badly, I was utterly terrified. When we got home, I went straight for a shower because I was covered in cold, clammy sweat. After getting into comfy clothes, I came into the living room. The TV was on, tuned to a news channel. A man had entered the park with a long kitchen knife and stabbed 4 or 5 people, nearly killing one of them. He went in through the exact same gate we had been only a few hundred meters from. I'm usually a logical, articulate, rational person, and all I can say is, thank you to whichever ancient instinct, pattern recognition, or intuition saved us that day. Story. Stout. In my early 20s, I had my first car. A friend and I went to a house party hosted by people we knew well. The party was great. High energy, everyone having a good time. Out of nowhere, I was overcome with a feeling of absolute dread, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't ignore. I told my friend it was time to go, now. He looked me in the eyes and didn't hesitate. Okay, let's go, he said. We both got in our cars and drove away. When we rounded the corner, we saw about 15 cars parked along the side of the road. It turned out a local gang, known for crashing parties, kidnapping people, torturing them, and assaulting couples, had found out about the party and were waiting to raid it. After we left, we heard that the gang had crashed the party, assaulted as many people as they could, kidnapped a few, and even ran over a partygoer as they drove away. It was a powerful lesson at a young age. Always trust your gut feelings. Story 39. When a very old, mafia-adjacent cab company owner pulled a revolver out of his desk during a business meeting while threatening to kill me and my boss, and his 3 sons were lunging at him to take control before he could pull the trigger. Good times. Additional context. He was eating a salad loaded with dressing as he worked himself into a rage. Then the salad and dressing started spraying out of his mouth as he yelled and rifled through multiple drawers looking for his gun. Honestly, the salad situation bothered me far more than the gun did. I didn't feel in real danger until my boss grabbed me and said, "We need to leave, now." That's when I realized, oh, this is bad. I'm not claiming to be brave. I just like to argue and, apparently, have no survival instincts. Story 40. About 5 years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to go wild camping, no tent, out in some beautiful hills. We left the car at the bottom and hiked for about 40 minutes up. We found a nice spot under some trees and dropped our bags. Then my boyfriend realized he'd forgotten his phone in the car. Normally not a big deal, but he'd left it in the sat-nav holder where it was clearly visible, and he didn't want anyone to see it and smash the window. So he headed back down. I stayed on the hill exploring, and when I saw him walking back up about an hour later, I ran down a bit to meet him. Right then we saw some cows coming toward us. I love cows, so I thought it was adorable. They got closer, and suddenly started bucking and kicking. Turned out it wasn't a bunch of cows at all. It was a field of young bulls. It was genuinely terrifying. They surrounded us, trying to barge into us, spinning around to kick, and getting close enough that one bad hit could have caved our faces in. My boyfriend started screaming at them and yelling at me to run. I was wearing flip-flops, so I kicked them off, and while he distracted the bulls, I sprinted barefoot across the hill. He was shouting for me to find a cattle grid to get somewhere safe. I ran around a corner and collapsed, crying, because I genuinely thought he was going to be killed. Where I'm from, cattle kill quite a few people, but I'd always assumed they were trampled while running, not that the animals actually attacked them. I sat there for about 10 minutes, shaking, and was just about to call for help when I finally saw my boyfriend running down the hill toward me. He said the bulls had circled him, but he found a branch on the ground and used it to keep them at a distance. When he stayed completely still for a bit, they eventually stopped kicking, and he backed away incredibly slowly until he could turn and run. They followed him, but he made it to the cattle grid in time. We were in so much shock, we just wanted to go home, but our bags were still on the hill. Luckily, my boyfriend had his car keys from going back for his phone, so we cut through some brambles to get to the car. My housemate let me in. My keys were in the bags. We slept until 5 in the morning, then drove back while my boyfriend crept up the hill. He made me wait at the bottom of the cow field. I couldn't see him. Suddenly, he came rocketing around the corner with both bags and the cows behind him. By 6 in the morning, the bulls were less interested and weren't running fast, so he made it back safely. We never went into a cow field again. We often talk about how crazy it all was, and how many things probably saved us. We could have been lying in our sleeping bags when the bulls came, then run, and left the car keys in our bags, stranded. They could have attacked me alone while I waited for him to get his phone. I think my boyfriend forgetting his phone actually saved us. He still gets reminded of this whenever he forgets something. So crazy. Always be wary of cows, my loves. Story 41. My girlfriend and I were hiking Mount Carlton, which is 820 meters high, when all of a sudden our Phones started sending multiple tornado warnings for the area. Reception is terrible there, so we only received the messages closer to the top. For a usually busy hiking area, it was eerily quiet. The summit has a lone fire watch cabin from many years ago and a 360-degree view stretching for miles across the national park. It's a spot where people usually relax after the long hike and take in the sights. While admiring the view, we could see clouds forming in different areas, and another tornado warning came through on our phones. We were already on high alert, but that was our moment of, yep, let's get the hell out of here. As we began our trek down the mountain into a more wooded area, the sky suddenly turned pitch black, and the loudest snap of thunder we had ever heard cracked right above us. A true nature-induced jump scare. Seconds later, pouring rain came down, turning the trail into a small river that drenched our hiking shoes. Soaked to the bone, we kept moving, happy that we were getting closer and closer to our car. A hiking trip we will never forget. Story 42. When the Virginia Tech shooting happened, my college in Southern Maryland went into a preventative lockdown. My best friend and I snuck off campus to go to the mall anyway. We weren't trying to be careless. We were troubled. Staying in our rooms watching the news was painful, but staying in and not watching the news felt impossible. So we didn't stay put. Stupid, but I think understandable. We were in a Walden Books trying to distract ourselves when I heard a shout and looked out into the mall. I saw 3 or 4 teenagers running past the bookstore in the same direction, and my brain immediately went into fight or flight mode. I grabbed my friend and dragged her to the back of the store, through the employees-only entrance, and into a bathroom. I locked the door, and we crouched on the floor in the dark for about 5 minutes. I called my mom on my flip phone, convinced we were in a mass shooting situation. Literally nothing was happening. I was just on edge, triggered by a bunch of kids my own age in a similar situation to my own, being murdered 300 miles away. I've been in a few potentially life-threatening situations since then. I was in Sudan teaching English when riots over rising prices broke out, shoving my students onto buses at the school's back door while tires were being set on fire at the front. While I was aware that things could go badly in those situations, that was the one time I truly thought, things are actively going very badly right now. Story 43. This wasn't me being scared, it was my friend. But looking back, it was entirely appropriate. I grew up in a very quiet suburb in Orange County, California. I was around 16 or 17, and my cousin who lived in Los Angeles invited me to her house for her birthday. I brought my best friend along, and we were both thinking we'd meet some cute girls from LA. Arrived early, and people were just starting to show up. As we were trying to acclimate, a group arrived that included a few guys and girls. Being from Orange County, we didn't know anyone there. I also had an older cousin, the brother of the cousin having the birthday, who was maybe in his early 20s. He discreetly motioned for me and my friend to follow him. We walked into his parents' bedroom, and I saw my uncle there. Right then, he plopped about 5 handguns down on the bed. My cousin said one of the guys at the party was from a rival gang, and they were worried something might go down. I remember both my uncle and older cousin saying, "Hey, Phoenix 1230 and Phoenix 1230's friend, grab a gun because we think something might happen." I was just trying to process it, but my friend's eyes were practically bulging out of his head. He grabbed me and whispered, "Phoenix 30, can we talk over here?" He pulled me to a corner and said, "We need to leave. Now." I was in complete agreement. I went to tell both my uncle and cousin that we needed to go, and they both looked at us and nodded. We walked over to my cousin, who was still chatting with her friends as if nothing was happening, and told her we had to go home because it was a long drive back. It was around 7 in the evening, and she looked at us and said, "I get it." Ultimately, nothing happened. But looking back, it was a wild experience for 2 kids from Orange County. I still remember the sound of the guns hitting the bed. Crazy, in my opinion. Story 44. I was out at a bar with my friends when I couldn't shake this feeling. I need to go home now. We were having fun and nothing seemed off, so I brushed it off for a while, but eventually the feeling wouldn't go away. I went home super early. When I walked in, the entire house smelled like gas. One of my dogs had turned on the stove while I was gone, but it hadn't ignited. I quickly shut it off and ran around the house, opening all the windows, even though it was winter. I got the fans out to clear the gas, focusing first on my bedroom, where I contained my dogs and cats. Slowly, the house aired out. I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't listened to my gut. I would have been out for hours. Story 45. After COVID started, My husband and I began going to the lake more often, even in the cold, rain, or snow. One day, I was standing on the pier, like I had a million times before, staring straight down into the water. There are metal bars jutting into the water, like stabilizers for the concrete, almost a partial ladder without rungs. There were no barriers, nothing preventing cars or people from going off the edge. The concrete pier just ended, and it was completely black water. I said, "Don't you wonder how many people have driven off here?" My spouse laughed and said, "No one." Why would you say that? I backpedaled a little because I didn't want him to think I was being darker, paranoid, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A day or two later, they pulled the car of 2 missing people from the exact spot where I had been standing. The same spot shown on the front page of the newspaper, with a diver positioned between the same metal bars I had stood between. There are barriers there now. Oh, and I had taken a picture that day. It shows the calm black water, a bit of the concrete pier, and the bars, but my feet are just out of frame. I still have the photo, and I can't tell if it's creepy or just memorable, because I didn't feel scared or get any kind of "we should leave" instinct. I just felt very strongly that something was down there. I've looked at the picture a million times, and you truly can't see anything, which somehow makes it even more unsettling. Story 46. It was getting late, so we were heading back to Bangkok by train. We got off at what we thought was our transfer station, but it wasn't. We found ourselves in a very run-down shanty town, entirely made of sheet metal. We had some time before the next train, so we decided to wander around a bit. Every single person we passed was staring at us. I don't think they saw many tourists there. There were also a lot of deformed dogs with tumors, scars, skin issues, and missing body parts, but they mostly kept to themselves. As it started to get dark, we tried to head back to the station. That's when panic set in. Everything looked the same in all directions, with no landmarks, just sheet metal huts. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was getting darker and our time was running short. We asked a few people for directions, and they seemed to point us the right way, so we made our way through the town. It was almost dark now, with very little lighting, and most of the people had disappeared from the streets. The place had become far more eerie. Surely, we were getting close to the station. Then the dogs no longer kept to themselves. We heard scuffling, fighting, and squealing. Dog wars. 2 groups of deformed dogs were fighting each other right in the streets. It was a sorry sight, but we carefully kept moving. Surely, we were nearly there now, though we were moving slower because it was so dark, and those rabid dogs could be anywhere. I thought I recognized a spot. A girl had asked for a photo there not long after we got off the train, so this must be the right way. And then, waiting on the path ahead of us, a giant group of rabid dogs. There were 4 of us, so we were being cautious, but the dogs were getting a bit cocky. We moved slowly, with them following behind. Their barking got more intense, and they started running past us, closer each time. We picked up bricks from the ground just in case, and essentially walked backward, facing the dogs as they confronted us with barks and drive-bys. It felt like a long time, but eventually we saw a light. Finally, we were at the station. The dogs seemed less interested here, probably because locals frequented this area and likely threw rocks at them, like we might have had to. But wait a second, why is the station now padlocked? There is no coming train. Holy crap, what do we do now? We had averted the dogs, but now we were stranded in a shanty town in the middle of nowhere, and leaving this area probably meant more rabid dogs. Across from the station were metal shanty buildings that looked like a mix of dwellings and businesses. Maybe we could ask if we could pay $100 or more for a ride. We knocked on one house, and a very skinny, dazed man opened the door. Of course, he spoke very little English. We tried to communicate that we needed a ride and would pay a lot. He said for us to come in. Why did we go in? The putrid smell of whatever meat he had been cutting, and the lack of any furniture was worrying. He spoke into Google Translate, and instead of saying, "Yes, I know a guy with a car," it came out as, "We must sleep here tonight. No thank you." We said thanks and left, though he was not happy at all, which was extremely creepy. Determined, we knocked on another shanty house that was fancier, with music playing and the smell of food. Immediately, a relief. A big, jovial, colorfully clad woman with children opened the door. She spoke excellent English, maybe not perfect, but very good. Without hesitation, she said she knew someone with a truck who could take us. We didn't even discuss money, though we offered. This kind man drove us for a whole hour to a nicer town with hostels, and he didn't even ask for payment. We had to insist before he would accept it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.